flowering leaves of all these life-giving trees that flow in the breeze, giving us the air to breathe, came from the seeds that sons and daughters had sown, passing down histories through stories, genes, and bones. Hear the whispers of the past, dictate your prologue, a generational trio through which memories are prolonged. So we reach down like nourishing waters to seek truths, except we receive nourishment when we're digging the roots.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. This is Nika Smith, and I'm here to welcome you, all of you who are tuning in from all over, and thanking you for taking your time out on this Wednesday night to talk genealogy and family history with us here at BlackProGen Live. It is Wednesday, November 15th, 2017, and you are in for an absolute special treat for this 46th episode of BlackProGen Live. Tonight's topic: the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Creek are revered groups of First Nations people who have a complicated history that involves chattel slavery. Learn about critical record sets when researching these groups and their complex relationship they have with their freedmen. I'll let you know early on that this show will not focus solely on blood quantums or how to qualify for membership to any nation. We'd be shortchanging the Freedmen story if we started off with that. And of course, we can always allot time to cover that on another date. This show is about exploring, discussing, and honoring the legacy of a group that is hardly ever spoken of, the freedmen of the 5 civilized tribes. At BlackProGen, we can't shortchange our ancestors' stories by just settling for a membership card. It's like being grateful for the 13th Amendment, but not truly digging into the experience of the people who it affected and lived its aftermath. So you're in for a really meaty, sometimes complex, emotional, sometimes funny story about the freedmen of the 5 civilized tribes. As always, we'd like to remind you to be sure to join the conversation now. Participate in the live chat on YouTube to the top right-hand corner of the screen if you're watching on a computer, or at the bottom of the YouTube app on your mobile device. You can also weigh in on Twitter by tweeting us at BlackProGen or using the hashtag BlackProGen. Have you ever been like, man, I can't believe I missed that episode? And maybe I need to send reminders to myself. Well, go ahead and set them. All you need to do is head to my YouTube page and click set reminder under the episodes you're interested in. They're listed in the live streams area, or simply subscribe to my channel and you'll get a reminder each and every time we go live. And who doesn't like free stuff? Have you ever wanted to attend Roots Tech? Well, here's your chance to go care of BlackProGen Live. Every person that submits a case to Ask Mariah for the month of November will automatically be entered for a chance to win a free 4-day pass to the conference being held February 28th to March 3rd at the Salt Palace in Salt Lake City, Utah. Choose from 200 plus classes on genealogy, as well as have access to one of the largest genealogy exhibit halls in the world with your favorite vendors to boot. Check the description of this and any BlackProGen Live episode for the link to submit your case for Ask Mariah, and maybe you might just be the person who wins our Roots Tech pass. So before we get to introductions of the regular panelists, I want to go ahead and make sure that I do a formal introduction for one of our guests tonight. And I have to apologize to Melissa Barker because I didn't give her a formalized slide last week. So we'll have to make sure we make hers have fireworks and pyrotechnic displays and whatnot when she joins us next year. But tonight's special guest is Terry Ligon. And I know this face, he's so familiar, but Terry is a history and genealogical researcher who has dedicated 28 years researching freedmen of the Indian Territory. One area of his expertise has been research on what is known as the Equity Case 7071, Betty Ligon et al. Versus the Chickasaw and Choctaw Nations and the Department of the Interior. All right, so now that my announcements are over, Hey y'all, what's going on? It's a lively crowd out there. The chat room is a flying. I am your host, Nika Smith here, resident Cherokee Freedmen in the house. Everybody else, unmute yourselves. And I'm so glad Terry popped up because we weren't sure we were going to see his face, but he is here. And True Lewis, she worked that on out in the sidebar. Love my True Lewis. All right, so let me go to my resident Choctaw Freedman with Sally Walton over her head because I know that's Miss Sally with the hat, Miss Angela Walton Raji.
Yes, hello everyone. Can you hear me well?
Your audio is a little choppy, but hopefully that'll be rectified.
Greetings, everyone. Yes, I am a Choctaw Freedman descendant and coming to you this evening from the beautiful state of Maryland on the eastern seaboard on the Chesapeake Bay. Hello, everyone.
All right. And we'll say hello to Terry since I already gave him a big round introduction. You can go ahead and unmute yourself, Terry. He's like, I'm not sure how to do that. There's a little mic in the middle of the screen. There's a little mic in the middle of the screen. True will work with you on unmuting yourself. All right, let's go down the line to Bernice Bennett.
No audio.
You're muted, Bernice. Everybody's muted tonight. Maybe it's on your headset you're muted. All right, Ellen.
Hey everybody, it's Ellen Fernandez-Sacco, LatinoGenealogy.com. I'm really happy to be here tonight.
All right, Teresa Vega.
Teresa Vega, Boricua. I want to say I'm Radiant Roots Boricua branches representing Uptown New York City.
All right. Terry, you're unmuted. Go right on ahead.
I am?
Yes, you are.
Well, that's a relief. Now, can you see me? Because I can't see a thing.
Yes, we can see you.
I am flying blind right here.
Just don't touch nothing. You're doing good.
She said, just trust us, even though you're blind.
Yeah.
Oh, Lord.
Okay.
Thank you so
Well,
much.
hello, everyone.
All right. He is checking in from California, from my old stomping grounds. We want to go ahead and check in with Bernice. Are you unmuted, Bernice? I think you need to make sure you're not muted here.
I'm not.
All right. There, I can hear you now.
Oh, okay. No. Hi, everybody. Bernice from Maryland. Research at the National Archives, Blog Talk Radio.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. Chat room is flying by. Pat Kahega, that is one of my buddies from one of the Camericans, went on the trip to Cameroon with me. Trisha Blount is in the chat room. Our buddy Yvette Porter Moore, Clarice Mason, Beverly Scruggs, Denise Muhammad, who I don't think has missed a single episode this year live. Jennifer A. Thompson is here. Renata, one of our regular panelists, she is in the house. Tammy Ozier. You guys are awesome. Just wanted to make sure we gave you a shout out and encourage you all to use the chat room and to be sure to tweet us because we are going to talk about a lot tonight. It's going to get real interesting because this is a very, 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 very interesting topic. And yes, as True does her Birdman hand rub. There's my pop culture reference for the evening. All right, so let's start off with a question.
Oh my God, there's a video here.
Terry got his video up. Thank God. All right, so first question I have for, of course, me, Angela, and Terry, and then, of course, anyone else on the panel wants to weigh in, but they said that they did not want to weigh in. They just want to sit and listen to us talk, which I don't want them just to do that, but still. Shake your finger at them in the chat room, make them talk. But first question we have is, let's talk about it. We're talking about the 5 civilized tribes. What nations make up the 5 civilized tribes and why are they called civilized? Anybody uncivilized?
Wasn't it because they were the group that they were able to take up agriculture, get them to be settled in a given area?
All right,
Angela. Just in a really basic sense.
Angela?
Okay. Well, it's important to understand that for quite a long time, these nations had contact with European arrivals. And because of the fact that to a degree, and of course when people are near each other, they acquire certain habits of, they influence each other's culture through exposure. Well, these individuals became quite assimilated in many ways. They did not abandon traditional practices, but they did become in many ways influenced by Europeans. These individuals, many of them began to practice a different type of farming methods, and many of them, as a result of becoming somewhat, for a lack of a better word, suddenly them as civilized. And of course, there's always that sense of other when people are coming in contact with each other. And with many of these tribes, well, all, they also were Southerners. They were in the southeastern corner of the United States, and they practiced another peculiar custom of Southerners, that institution that we know as Black chattel slavery as well.
All right, Terry, is there anything you want to add in to the discussion with regard to why, you know, they're called civilized, or just from that vantage point?
Well, I can't add much more to it other than the fact that the institution of slavery was one of the main causes for them having that name of being civilized, practicing European institutions, and therefore making them more acceptable as far as a body of people. As you get more and more into their history, I guess you have to define what is civilized behavior when I look at it in that way, because a lot of times when we get hung up on those labels, we tend to be the brunt end of those issues. So by them being civilized means we're enslaved, therefore giving them some kind of energy to be more than or superior to us. And when I started doing my research, I took a different way of looking at it, that there was a sense of empowerment in having that knowledge of what our ancestors went through, and that civilized label no longer held any sway as far as my way of thinking. And I think once you allow that to take over, then they become the more powerful entity rather than you being powerful in accepting the history and knowledge of your people. So I kind of reject it. That's why I refer to them as the 5 slave-holding tribes.
All right. So that's a change in lexicon, just as we have heard from many esteemed speakers over time, not to use slaves, use the word enslaved, use slaveholder.
Correct.
Perhaps we need to transition from saying the 5 civilized tribes to the 5 slaveholding tribes. That's a challenge for everybody this evening. So moving forward, let's talk about the locations and enclaves of freedmen of these particular nations. We're talking about Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole. Where do they live now? And then, of course, once we finish that discussion, I'll actually bring up a map so people can see where the Indian Territory was, and also which counties in what is now Oklahoma exist within what, you know, the bounds of those particular nations. So,
well, you want me
yeah,
to take
go
part of
ahead.
that?
Yeah, go ahead. That's it's the 3 of us leading the conversation.
Well, when it comes to Chickasaws, it's interesting about their history that when they first arrived into Indian Territory, that they feared the Western Indians, so they basically didn't want to go too far west and wanted to remain in part of the Choctaw tribe, Choctaw Nation. And so they basically inhabited the southern part of what is now Oklahoma, and they had, I think there was basically 4 or 5 different counties which they used. I can remember a couple of them: Mushlatubbie, Pickens, and a few others that escape me right now. And basically, for me, my work concentrates on that southern part of Oklahoma, right near the Red River on the Texas border, which is now in Carter County, in the surrounding counties around Love, Carter, Murray, and I forget a couple of the other ones to the west and north.
Okay, and then not sure where Angela went, but when we talk about enclaves of where freedmen live now, because when you talk about freedmen of the 5 civilized tribes or the 5 slaveholding tribes, right? Got to change our language, right?
Yeah.
What we're discussing too is, in addition to the forced removal out of states like, you know, Alabama or Mississippi or Tennessee or North Carolina, once those folks were taken as slaves or potentially as free people to the Indian Territory, there was a second, of course, migration that took place within this particular group, the Great Migration. Some of those folks left what was the Indian Territory and then became Oklahoma and then repatriated to other places. So another one of those, an enclave where there are a lot of freedmen currently living is in California. There are a ton of freedmen that live in Northern and Southern California. It's like Oakland and LA are crawling with freedmen, in particular the Cherokee freedmen. I know, well, that's how I was born in Southern California. It makes perfect sense. But where are other enclaves of freedmen outside of Oklahoma? Angela, would you like to answer that?
I hope my audio is a little bit better. Is this better?
Yes, it's better. It's better.
Okay. Okay. Well, of course, historically, we know they came from the southeastern part of the U.S., what we now know as northeastern, and actually the whole eastern half, where certainly they were up until, I'd say, the early years of the Great Migration. Now, as you pointed out, and Terry himself also, California, certainly there's a very large community of freedmen descendants. A lot of my Choctaw freedmen relatives, cousins live in the Bakersfield area, quite a few of Choctaw freedmen in that area. And don't forget Kansas City. Oh my gosh, Kansas City, both Kansas and Missouri, Creek freedmen and Cherokee freedmen, and a few folks who sort of dropped up north, up in Chicago area as well. And there's some Creek freedmen, clusters of them living in Washington State. So you find people, of course, people migrate where they knew others from their own area had settled, and which is why we have so many in California. There were so many people, from what I understand, and you Californians can confirm this, that yearly there were state picnics, Arkansas picnics, and Oklahoma picnics, and various gatherings, I guess clubs, social clubs. But historically, nation, if you're looking where people are from, of course, the northern part, LaFleur County, moving further down around McAllister, a lot of freedmen families there, and of course, southeast corner, which is Idabel, tons and tons of families in Idabel and Bonita and that area. So, of course, I focus a lot on Choctaw freedmen research. But of course, if you get to Tulsa, you're talking Creek freedmen as much as you're talking as well. And of course, rural places like Bonita, Tahlequah, Nowata, those were Cherokee freedmen communities historically, but their descendants live in Southern California, Northern California, Arizona, Washington, everywhere now. But there are some clusters, and pay attention to Tulsa, Kansas City, and some of those places. So.
All right, so what I want to do now is present a map to everybody so you have a context of what we're talking about. And this is a map of the Indian and Oklahoma territories as of 1892. This was from Library of Congress, and this is what what it looked like at that particular time. In the top right-hand corner, or the northeasternmost corner of what became Oklahoma, you have the Cherokee Nation. And then if you go just west of that is where the Creek Nation is. Right underneath that is where, in the orange, is where the Choctaw Nation was. And just east of the Choctaw Nation was the Chickasaw Nation. And so kind of lock this image into your mind as I flip to the next slide, because it's going to make perfect sense once you see me do it. This is a map of current Oklahoma by county. And if you look at it, you can see which counties are where the Indian Territory was. So this should give you a baseline idea. If your family originated in some of these counties, if people are claiming Cherokee ancestry and they're saying that they were from Craig County or Nowata or Rogers or Mays or even Delaware, that is a huge clue that you're dealing with a population of freedmen. Remember, we're not talking about by blood. We're talking about freedmen during this conversation, okay? So you know, that's a great indicator if we're talking about Cherokee Nation. If you go further east, you're talking Tulsa, Creek, McIntosh, sort of kind of bisecting Muskogee. You're talking the Creek Nation. If you go further south, just as Terry talked about, LaFleur, McCurtain, Choctaw County, you're dealing with the Choctaw Nation. If you go further east, and you're talking about Murray, Johnston, Love, Carter, you know, stuff that borders northern Texas, you're
West.
dealing with the Chickasaw Nation. Go ahead, Terry.
You go west for Chickasaw Nation. You said east.
Yeah, I'm sorry, east. My bad.
Minor correction.
Yeah, minor correction. So this is something that is key to your genealogy research, and this is not to say that you don't have, you know, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, any of these nations' roots if your family is not, you know, is not here when you're researching them. But they should go back to this area at some point if it's going to be easily traceable in the ways that we're talking about tonight. So this is something that you should just lock into your brain right about now. I hope that was helpful because Photoshop made that happen. All right. So there are a couple questions from the chat room, which I think are good ones. Shelly Murphy throws out, did all five tribes have slaves? And feel free. Yes, they did.
Yes,
which is
they
why
did.
Terry
That is
gave them
correct.
the moniker, instead of the 5 civilized tribes, the 5 slaveholding tribes. That's why.
I will toss out a little caveat because I think the Seminole Nation had a slightly different history than the other 4. And in fact, when you look at some of the historical documentation, it would always say the 4 mother tribes, and that does not include the Seminole Nation because it was slightly different. It came about from the Creek Nation and runaway slaves, and their interaction with their enslaved people was, I think, slightly different.
Slightly.
But still, you know, anybody that's held in bondage is enslaved. So it's hard to make the distinction. But when you really read the history, you'll get a different sense of how their interactions with the Seminole Nation was different from the other 4.
All right. And another question from the chat room is, who out of the 5 slaveholding tribes had the most slaves? Sort of a follow-up question is, how early are we talking in terms of being, you know, slaveholding tribes? Are we talking 1820s or earlier? I can answer that. Yes, it was before that. Based on my research, at least with the Cherokee Nation, I have ancestors going back to my 5th times great-grandparents who were born during the 1700s who were enslaved by the Cherokee. So this goes into colonial America, because what you have to remember, and this is an important point I think we need to make, is we're dealing with countries that existed within the United States, countries within a country, right? So the record keeping, these are sovereign nations. And they had their own records, they had their own customs, they had their everything was how they wanted it to be. That's something that we have to consider when we're having this conversation. That's why this is sort of a complex thing, because, you know, we're talking about counties within Oklahoma now, but prior to 1905, that area was not the United States. So you're dealing with, just as you would, you know, knowing boundary lines for different counties, parishes, things like that, you have to understand timelines and when these areas became part of the United States and when they were not. But to answer the question, Angela, would you like to throw to respond to which nation was the most slaveholding nation among the 5?
Well, so it's the Seminole Nation. And I think if you look, and I think in one of my blog posts, I actually made a physical count from based on the slave schedules of 1860. And I'd say the Cherokee Nation was probably leading, but not by, maybe by several hundred. Between the other 4 tribes, we're talking, and I can pull up those numbers in a second to give you exact figures, but we're talking about 60, when the federal census was conducted, there was a head count of those who were enslaved by tribe. And pretty much the Choctaws had quite a few as well, but I would say the Cherokees probably had a little bit more, but it was not substantial. It wasn't where, and we're talking by tribe, anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 scattered across the countryside. Maybe some slaveholders had one person enslaved. You had, of course, exceptions like Robert Jones in the Choctaw Nation, who had over 500 people enslaved on 3 different farms. Chief John Ross and his family, he and Lewis Ross and others had over 100 slaves within their family unit.
That's in the Cherokee Nation, to distinguish between the.
I'm sorry, yes,
yeah.
Chief John, the Cherokee Nation. Peter Pitchlynn and others in the Pitchlynn family from the Choctaw Nation. Certainly, among them, if you combine the Pitchlynn family enslaved people, you will find well over 100 people as well. But I would say probably Cherokee Nation, but I do have that on a blog, those exact figures. I'll pull them up in a second for you.
Yeah, that was going to be my first answer. Was going to be that it was the Cherokee Nation. Okay, you've got some bad reverb, Angela, so I'm going to mute you while you're not talking.
Okay. All right.
All right, so moving forward, we've got a lot of questions in the chat room. I mean, the chat room was like, they're eating all this up. So trust me and True are taking note of them. We're going to get to a lot of them because everybody is like, they're hungry. Apparently there's a lot of hungry people, and we are preparing Thanksgiving dinner 2 weeks early with this conversation. No pun intended with the use of Thanksgiving and First Nations people. Please understand that. I understand about the blankets with smallpox. All right, so moving forward, why do you think conversations about citizenship with regard to these nations always push actual genealogy into the backseat? Because typically when folks discover they have ancestry tied to, one of these nations, the first question always is, well, how can I become a member? It's almost as though genealogy becomes completely unimportant in the pursuit of actual membership. Why do you all think that is? I mean, in my experience, just from talking to people at conferences and things like that, especially when I give presentations about being a Cherokee freedman and my tie to the Cherokee Nation, the first question that folks ask me afterwards is, well, I would like to do that because I'm trying to get my child money for school, or I'm trying to do XYZ. Why do you think actual genealogy doesn't get as much attention?
Well, can you hear me right now? Okay, hold on.
Yeah, I think Terry, I can hear you. Terry wants to talk after you.
Okay. Well, I think one of the things that has happened over the years, and this is unfortunate, and this has come from the genealogy community. The few Native American genealogy websites have equated researching Native American ancestry with tribal membership, and they should be separated. And unfortunately, a lot of individuals from the public have bought into that. Oh, if I research this, then I'm going to get a reward. Wrong with that concept. And the other part is that sadly there are many who do gain membership, and for many of them all they're getting is bragging rights and a card. But for many, interest, once they have been sort of declared a member of a certain group, and they themselves lose the quest for the story. And I find that to be very, very tragic, that many people who, even individuals who are related to the 5 tribes, once they find the information that they're seeking, somebody was on the roll, or, oh, I've gotten a CDIB card, they're gone into the sunset and could not care less about the stories of endurance, the traditions, the culture, the stories of survival, the stories of resistance. Anyway, I'll let Terry talk. I mute myself.
Terry? We cannot hear you, Terry. I don't quite know what happened there. Something's going on with your audio. Okay, so in the interim, let me go ahead and get to some of these questions in the chat room. There was a question, and and there's a person that's asking about the Trail of Tears. We are going to talk about that. That's up in the discussion. We've got that framework out, so don't think we're not going to talk about that as well. But one of the questions from the chat room is, and Terry, your audio working? No, we can't hear you. Okay. One of the questions from the chat room is, what tribes were in Alabama? Family stories about a grandmother who was Cherokee from Houston County, Alabama. And my first inclination is to say that if there was anybody there in Alabama, it was not, if it had to be in certain parts of Alabama for it to be Cherokee. Angela, you just
She's
muted yourself. Angela.
Am I
Okay, I
unmuted
can hear
now?
you now.
Sorry.
Yeah, you're unmuted now.
One of the things that I tell people, learn your historic geography. Where's your family from? Read the history. When you read the history, you're going to know what tribes were in that part of your state. Because in one part of the state, you may have individuals who were Creek, and the Creeks were largely in what I would call, I guess, eastern part of Alabama. But there's a part of western that was also Choctaw, because that was part of the old Choctaw territory. And, there may have been some smaller ethnic groups that are there, which is why you learn your local history. But you also want to refrain from just saying in a particular state. Well, states did not, or individual nations did not adhere to drawn up state border lines. Nations certainly on state borders. So you really want to learn the history of the region live. But I would say Creek, except western parts, some of them that touch the state of Mississippi were also Choctaw.
Okay, Terry, you want to try it out now? Nah, we can't hear you. I don't know. I would say go out and come back in and see if that helps. That might change things. Okay. Let's see. All right. So another question from the chat room. We've got, were the African held people by the tribes treated the same as the plantation holders treated them? Absolutely. That's something that I think is a big part of what we're talking about, that really needs to be illuminated when we're talking about sovereign nations that are within the United States, that existed before the United States was created. You have to remember, there, as I just mentioned earlier, that there were systems that were within those, and there were slave codes within these nations. If a Cherokee, a freedman, who was enslaved at that particular point in time, disrupted a church service, they would be whipped. Which disruption could be interpreted in a number of different ways. So you can't conflate, really there is no difference in my opinion, because, and just as Terry mentioned earlier, slavery is slavery. You don't have 1/4 slavery and you know what I mean, and a full slavery. It's slavery is slavery. Anything else you want to chime in on, Angela, with regard to that question?
Yes. Okay. There is no kind version of enslavement. Kindness, when it comes to quote unquote ownership of a human being. Slaves were whipped. Slaves also ran away. Now, there are individuals who literally make up stories. Oh, they took us in. It was a kind of
Come on, say that, please. I hate hearing that.
I know. And I know sometimes it's something that people want to hear, but if it was so kind, the 1842 Cherokee slave revolt, you would not have had as late as 1861 a slave uprising in the northern part of the Choctaw Nation. These were human beings wanted to be free, and ownership of a human being is ownership of a human being, and it is a violation of the human spirit. It does not exist in a kinder flavor or a kinder way. Free in itself act. Slaves were not only whipped, had bare lashes on the back. There's the story out of the Choctaw Nation when the story of Lucy, the slave who was burned alive. And no, these stories are not all pretty. And we know that that is the case of slavery in the rest of the United States. It was not pretty.
It definitely was not pretty. All right, so let's have a conversation. We'll try to see if we can get Terry back in. He's been having some I was going to say he's having some Terry difficulties. He's been having some technical difficulties. So in terms of how you can confirm oral history to a tie to freedmen, right? We're just going to talk about this briefly because this is not a show where we describe to you in depth, line by line, how to fill out your application to become a member of a nation. That's not what the function of this is. It's just to talk about and illuminate the stories of the freedmen of the 5 slaveholding tribes. So in terms of confirming oral history to a tie to your nation, we already brought up the fact that you're looking for these prime locations or these specific locations in, the eastern part of Oklahoma. And remember, I have to bring the conversation back. We're not talking about any other First Nations people during this show, except for the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole. So don't ask about the Blackfoot, because we're not talking about them. Okay. And most folks that usually say that they have Blackfoot ancestry don't have it. I'm just going to put that out there. Okay. If they do have a tie to a First Nations group, and it's, in particular, I can't say it's all, right? There's never a catch-all for everything. It would usually be one of these particular nations. But in terms of confirming oral history, you're looking at locations, right? You're looking at the eastern part of Oklahoma. If your family did not make it through the forced removal, there are particular regions you can look at in North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi. But as we mentioned earlier, you need to do the geographical research to find out if those nations lived in those counties or areas that your family is from, to verify if that is indeed a tie, to even potentially substantiate that. If you're looking in a county and there is no record of those nations living there, that kind of is your first clue that it may not be that particular group. Okay. But that isn't to cancel it out completely. It's just to say that you may want to look at another group, right? All right. So with regard to that, usually the first thing that people do, of course, you're going to do your genealogy. Doing, freedmen research for these particular groups does not supersede genealogy, right? You need to start with yourself. You need to go backwards to your parents, grandparents, follow that particular line that is supposed to have that line of descent from a First Nations group or connection to a First Nations group. In this instance, we're talking 5 slaveholding tribes. You're going to do those census records, 1930, 1940, 1920, 1900. When you get to 1900, there is a special census of First Nations people, but the average person doesn't know that it exists because it's at the very back of the images. Let's say it's 42 images and you get to image 40 and there's a blank page, and all of a sudden you see a census schedule that looks completely different than the ones that came before that. And that in certain areas is where the special Indian schedules are. If you're talking about Oklahoma, the 1900 census is territorial because Oklahoma did not become a state until 1905. Right? So you're tracing back there. Then at that point, because we're dealing with pre-statehood Oklahoma, you're going to get into other records. And usually folks' first tie is the Dawes roll. That's usually how people first tie their ancestry to one of these nations. You want to go ahead and take it from there, Angela?
Okay. Okay. In terms of that time period, those 2 census schedules that you mentioned, of course, in 1900, it was Indian Territory. By 1910, it was the state of Oklahoma. And many individuals who are part of the freedmen communities in what is now Oklahoma, but of course, at that time, the 5 nations, of course, recorded on the almighty Dawes rolls. Everyone has heard of the Dawes rolls, Dawes. And the Dawes rolls are very important in terms of genealogical. This was the purpose of the Dawes roll was not for us, as genealogists 100 and something years later, but the purpose of the roll was actually to determine the eligibility to receive a land allotment. This process began in the 1890s. It ended, well, officially in 1907, but technically it ended in 1914. This process created, and it consisted of interviews that went on for several years throughout all 5 tribes and determining the eligibility for land allotments. That is because prior to that time, land was held in common, everyone. But statehood was approaching. In 1907, and to get to the point of statehood, the point was to divide the nations into private, personal parcels of land, a European concept of land ownership. And then once everyone who was eligible, meaning everyone who was a citizen of their tribe, who was able to prove that they were citizens, they would receive a land allotment of anywhere from 40 to 300 acres or more, depending upon your tribe and what was decided upon. After that process ended, the rest of the land would be open for white settlement in the new emerging state of Oklahoma, which we know took place in 1907. The Dawes rolls, however, left us with literally thousands of families that have been documented, 14,000 freedmen, 14,000 individuals of files who were interviewed, who received allotments of land. And when I say 14,000, that is including children, that is including babies. Every person in a household received a land allotment. It doesn't mean that they held on to the land. There were plenty of land grafters right there to con people out of their land and trick them out of it. Different story. But the fact is that this enormous record set of over 14,000 individuals classified as freedmen, and this includes whom were born free, had never been enslaved, some whom even among the elders had not been enslaved, because some were living free in those nations as well. And of course, those who were formally enslaved, officially enslaved as well. They could prove their tie to the nation, and they too received land allotments. And this record set is invaluable. It's so crucial. But it's not the only record, but it is sort of the launching pad to now launch you into a whole new set of records to document your tie to these nations. It's one of the most extensive record sets, especially for African Americans who have ties to at least these 5 nations.
Absolutely. And something that you have to remember as well, and someone in the chat room, I had to kind of tell them, be patient, we're going to get to this. Everybody's jumping the gun. It's a lot of people waiting at the starting line that are getting false starts because they want to like, hurry up, I'm trying to get to the stuff I want to hear. Well, you got to remember, everybody doesn't have this context, right? So we got to start ground floor. Angela brings up great points, great things that she's talking about when it comes to the Dawes roll. But we have to remember that the Dawes roll is not where the Freedmen story starts. It's where the discovery of the Freedmen story usually starts for us. But in terms of those ancestors who were on that roll, their story did not start with that roll. Their story preceded that role. There was centuries potentially of history in a particular family or families that began before the Dawes roll. It's just that, as I mentioned, we're sort of meeting our freedmen ancestry at that Dawes roll, and that's a really huge jumping off point. Here's the other thing I want to remind folks of. If you do locate ancestors, whether they're direct or not, in your family that were included in the Dawes records, but they were not approved, that does not mean that that information within that file, within that packet, within that card is not valuable. Do not throw away that information if you have someone confirm that you found on a Dawes roll. I can tell you right now, out of the, I don't know how many I've encountered in my family on my paternal grandmother's side, I only have 2 that were approved. Only 2. And those are the slimmest of the files because it was very straightforward with the interview, right? What's your name? Were you on the 1880 roll? Okay, great, boom, blah, 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 you're approved. For the folks that were not approved or that were doubtful, you have to remember that they had to try, I mean, they were going to try no matter what to get approved. So that means they bring in different witnesses, documents, all sorts of stuff. My 3rd great grandmother, her file was 80 pages and she was still, denied. But in that file, I got back another generation. I discovered other relationships. So you can't just throw away a Dawes file when someone isn't approved, and you can't then, of course, now use that as a means to gain membership, in particular to the Cherokee Nation. The question was asked, had I been approved yet? My application is sitting there. It's been sitting there for a year. We've had the court decision in August when it comes to the Cherokee Nation. So I'm waiting for them to send me my card and the current time. So let's do a little bit of show and tell. We're going to break up the monotony a little bit because I think this is great. And okay, there's a couple questions here. How frequently were cases appealed? All the time. They would post up, you would see in the Dawes files. That's actually one of the things I like seeing is when they would include for documentation purposes when the flyers were put up in a particular area, and they would give people dates when to show up. The Dawes Commission is going to be here from these dates, and you need to come. If we've sent you a letter, you need to show up between these dates at this location. I like to see that people try to appeal as much as they possibly can. They could, and sometimes you will find, at least my experience with the Cherokee Nation, people would go multiple times. So they may have one doubtful number, one rejected number, and then they might have the actual approved number. It could be 3 different numbers, and sometimes it's the same file. Sometimes you find stuff in one that you didn't find in the other. It's kind of a lot. But I'm going to move into show and tell. I'll start with the Cherokee, and then Angela, we'll roll through. I'll do Terry had some slides. We can't get him back in at this point, but it's stuff that both of us can talk about. So it's nothing that's like, I've never seen this in my entire life, nothing like that. All right. So for show and tell, we're going to talk about how you can track slavery in the nations. And it's different than it is in the United States, right? Remember, we're talking about sovereign nations here. To me, it's actually easier to trace the enslaved in the 5 slaveholding tribes than it is in the United States, because in these environments, you had to prove that you had a tie to the nation. And in that instance, you had to list, or you had to name who your slaveholder was. And so this is one example that I'm going to show. This is for the Cherokee. This is from an Eastern Cherokee application, which was part of the Guion Miller case. And this is for George Musgrove. It was dated August 21st, 1908. And in this basically, it's an affidavit. It's a sworn affidavit that he's given so that he can be approved for payment as part of the Guion Miller case, which has to do with the Eastern Cherokee. He states his age. He talks about he says he's about 50 years old, which means that as of that date, he was born about 1908. He states who his slaveholder was, who was William Musgrove. He also states the name of his parents. He mentions that his father is half Cherokee and half African. He mentions his father's slaveholder, who was Joseph Van, who was Rich Joe Van. If you've ever heard of the Cherokee slaveholder, Rich Joe Van, there's a whole big story there we can't even get into tonight. That's a whole separate episode. And he also mentions the names of his grandparents being being Quilly and Coltisa Baldridge. And if you notice, we have several surnames at work here. There's Musgrove, Baldridge, Van. All of those surnames are associated with one family. So that would be something that would be a parallel that you would see potentially in, the United States when you're doing research. But that is definitely the case when you're dealing with the enslaved in the 5 slaveholding nations. Moving forward, another example of how you can easily trace slavery in the nations is Civil War pension files. And we could do an entire show on just Civil War pension files of those from the 5 slaveholding tribes. This is a Civil War pension file deposition from Clement Van Rogers. You may recognize that name. He is the father of Will Rogers, who was a humorist and cowboy from the Indian Territory, who was Cherokee. Will Rogers' father was a slaveholder. And Will Rogers' father testified in this pension file for a man named Charles Rab Rogers. Charles Rab Rogers, in fact, with his brother Houston, is who taught Will Rogers how to rope and do everything. He learned it from them, from his father's slaves. In this deposition, Clem says, I knew Charles Rogers when he was a child. My mother raised him as a slave, and he was turned over to me in 1856. I owned him from 1856 until he ran away to enlist. So this is from a Civil War pension file. So of course, as we talk about, you know, records specific to the 5 civilized tribes, you have to remember that they're also wrapped into American records as well. Moving forward, this was submitted by Terry. This is from the application for membership for Margaret Ann Wilson for the Chickasaw Nation. She mentions that she was owned at the time by Benjamin Love, who was a Chickasaw Indian by blood and came to this country, meaning the Indian Territory, with him, and that she lived with said Benjamin Love until sometime during the war when she was sold to Charlie Wilson. And then the said Charlie Wilson was a Choctaw Indian by blood. So we have 2 5 slaveholding tribes. Gosh, I keep doing that. My bad. Let me go back. We have 2 5 slaveholding tribes here in this one document with Margaret Ann Wilson. Next, Terry submitted a piece that came from the House of Representatives petition of freedmen of the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations. And this provides names of former slaves 6 years, just 6 years after the Civil War, and about 25 years before the Dawes enrollment process. And these are just names of people who said that they were formerly enslaved by those 2 nations, and they wanted, they wanted to be known. They filed a case for citizenship for those nations. All right, moving forward, Angela, let's talk about this, because this is something we just spent a lot of time talking about, which is a freedman card for the Choctaw Nation.
Yes, this is the enrollment card of my great-grandparents as well as my grandfather. He's there. They lived in the Scullyville County area. Their post office was in Oak Lodge, and they were enrolling and applying for their land allotments. Obviously, they were, appearing in front of the Dawes Commission. You see my great-grandparents, Sam and Sally Walton, my Uncle Houston, my grandfather, who is Sam Jr., and their half-sister, or Samuel's stepdaughter, Louisa Ingram. We call her Louisa. And over to the right, you will see a column that says slave of. That means that Samuel, who's on that first line, was the slave of someone called Jim Davis. Sally, my great-grandmother, the woman on the wall behind me that you see in the little calico hat over there, she did not die until 1961. So I knew her personally and did not know until I discovered this card that she was enslaved. She was a slave of Perry. I think you might have other information that's there. Of course, you see their age, their gender, the relationship to the head of the household. And of course, on a typical card, if the parents in the household were at least, of course, this was 1899, if they were at least 35 years or older, then they were most likely born enslaved. And so here you have it, literally in front of your face, who the slaveholder was. So really rich data. On the reverse side of that same card, you find information. Now, I know who my great-grandparents were, Sam and Sally, but look at that first column. I don't know if you can see it properly. It says the name of the father, meaning the father of the person on the opposite side of the card. If they were enrolled, it tells you that his father says non-citizen, and the name of the mother, Lydia Drenard, it says, and of course who the slaveholder was of the mother as well. And of course, Sally appeared on line 2 on the opposite side. The name of her father was Eastman Williams. They were from Scullyville, which was the area. And notice one thing, it said father's owner. Well, her father wasn't owned by anyone. He was a Choctaw Indian himself. Her mother was Manda Hunt, a name that I have seen many times in the family Bible. She lived in Sugarloaf County, and she was enslaved by Emmeline Perry in that column where it says mother's
we can hear you, Terry.
Oh, he made it great.
Terry made
Welcome
it back,
back.
so I might flip back to his images for just a
Look,
second.
I knew Angela could talk and talk and talk until I got back here. I had no problem or worry, okay? Don't look at me like that. You know what I'm talking about, grasshopper.
Anywho, back to, is there anything else you want to say about this card before we move on to the last one?
No, only in the case of the card. I literally got, when I made that discovery of that enrollment card, and by just looking at the next image, which was the reverse side of that card, I got 4 new ancestors that I had never had before. And so between Pat Drenard and Lydia and Eastman Williams and Manda Hunt, wow, what a gift for a genealogist to get 4 new ancestors. Genealogically, it is a gold mine.
All right. And moving forward, you've also submitted this in terms of tracing the Choctaw enslaved. This was the application for enrollment for Sally Walton. We talked about Miss Sally that was behind your head. And in it, there's a man named Hall Perry who was interviewed on her behalf. And he states that Sally was a former slave of his sister.
Emily.
And
yes,
Emily,
and actually, you can't see it very clearly. Actually, his name was Nail Perry. It looks like Hall because it's kind of fuzzy, but it was Nail Perry, and he was the brother of the slaveholder, and he was her proof. His word was the proof that she needed to prove that she was also a part of the nation, and her mother had been also enslaved, and so valuable information. This is just page 1 of 4 pages that are part of the family interview.
All right. And so that's the end of show and tell for now. But something that's a very important point that I want to make to everyone is, there's just questions flying. So of course I'm trying to get to everything. But there's a person in the chat room named Gerard who brings up a very important point, and this is something I think we have sort of talked about, but we haven't talked about it directly, is that race informed these roles a lot. So if you do find your ancestors were on the freedman role, that does not necessarily mean that they don't have a degree of Indian blood or that they weren't descended from that particular nation. We just had a clear example right here from Angela's family where it lists that a Choctaw Indian was her direct ancestor. And in several families' cases, in particular my own, we were segregated off of the by-blood roll. We have to also mention that these Dawes rolls were segregated. The Cherokees or the First Nations folks there was a by-blood roll, there was an intermarried whites, there was a freedman roll, there was adopted whites, there was several striations. And there were a lot of errors that took place with these rolls. They were not perfect. So as I mentioned earlier, don't throw away the Dawes packet if there's not an approved Dawes packet for your family, because that information is still very rich. The same thing with don't assume that there may not have been, a degree of Indian blood or, a genetic or relational tie to the nation if your family has been segregated off of the rolls. Because what my experience has told me is that a lot of freedmen do have connections, genealogically speaking, by blood to these nations. They were just segregated off of the roles that designated such. Terry, is there anything you'd like to say before we move on in the conversation?
I think one of the reasons why they were segregated is you have to look at the political dynamics of the situation. We're talking about millions of dollars in land, basically, and mineral rights that are on the land, and it was to the benefit of not only the tribes but the U.S. government to minimize the amount of people who would receive land by blood, because that meant a higher amount of land, especially in Choctaw and Chickasaw nations, where a freedman got 40 acres of land. Someone by blood would have received 320 acres of land. And it was also recognized that freedmen reproduced at a faster rate than Native Americans. Therefore, they had a fear that the former slaves who were basically considered freemen but had Indian blood would take over the tribes, and tribe would be considered a black tribe. That was very prevalent in the Chickasaw Nation. When you look at the percentage of former or freedmen to tribal citizenship, it was practically equal. I think 4,000 plus on each side, and that's not including intermarried white. So you had a dynamic there that would have possibly prevented some oil companies. I was just reading a congressional record today where oil execs were coming into the nation and they were complaining that they were not getting the benefit of the deal because of all the land that was going to these freedmen. So that was an issue that had a lot to do with how people were classified. Aside from the racial aspects of classifying people by the way they look as opposed to their ancestry. Because you can look at, and I find, we were talking about this earlier today about DNA and how people were saying that you can't use DNA in an effort to say that you have a tribal affiliation, and that may be true. But through DNA and good genealogical research, you can prove that you have an ancestral tie to someone on the blood roll. So you can't just throw out the DNA, which I find a lot of people who are citizens of the nation want to hold on to that idea that DNA is bogus because it won't show you what tribe you're from, but it will show you who your ancestors were.
Exactly. And that's a very good point. The DNA cannot be used for membership. We're just talking about membership briefly. DNA cannot be used for membership, but it can confirm that you are tied to people and you are related through people who are on the by blood roll. That's what it can do, which then would substantiate oral history claims that your family may have made, or that, the oral history stuff that have been passed down. So let's talk about, let's take a deep dive in terms of the true story of the Trail of Tears and forced removals. Why do you think that the freedman voice has been largely eliminated from those narratives?
Well, I'll jump in. Can you hear me? Hopefully
Yes, we can.
It's coming through clearly.
We can.
One of the things that I think that, again, Terry pointed out, a lot of it is all about the land. Well, it's all about a whole lot of things. With land, you're also talking about money. And, if you have a certain sympathy, it's going to bring people to your cultural center, to your casino, whatever. I think that a lot of times it is interesting. One part that gets left out of the narrative of the forced migration was that enslaved people were on the same trail, died on the same trail, suffered on the same trail. And keep in mind that we're talking about a people who, for the second time within many families, were being forced westward. And they were then removed. It began in 1831 after the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, which was signed in 1829. The Choctaws left in the winter of 1830 and 31 and began their westward trek. Now, there were some others who had left early on who said, hey, we're going to go and scout out this. Those became early old settler Cherokees. But the real migration beginning in 31 and, of course, throughout the 1830s, you then had the Creeks and, of course, the Cherokees. And it's actually the Cherokee the real Trail of Tears, oftentimes referred to because of the fact that almost a third of the nation died on that trail. Many, of course, traveling under harsh conditions. But don't forget, the only people dying were not all people who were quote unquote native people. Many Africans were on the same trail. As a friend of mine says, who do you think had to carry the luggage? You know, but I think it's one of those things that it changes the narrative when people who are viewed as victims across the board, and you realize, wait a minute, you were victims, but you were also oppressors. You were taking slaves with you. Wait a minute, that kind of changes the narrative. So of course, and you will find no even mention of enslaved people in many of the histories of the nations if you go on the current websites. And the thing is that it's almost as if freedmen are being forced to wear this badge of slavery, as if, you know, there's something that's just so horrific about having had an ancestor enslaved. No, there isn't. Our ancestors were survivors. And but the fact is that our narrative, and our narrative, just as our narrative is here in America, our narrative for those of us who are descendants of freedmen, Oklahoma freedmen, our narrative is in our nation. And no, you can't have me not tell the story of what happened from Mississippi to Scullyville. That's part of my narrative, and it is my responsibility to tell it and to make sure that it's not omitted, because it's been omitted. And unfortunately, until really, I'd say 1993 was when I really published my first book on how to even research the freedmen. Never even in the genealogy community had you ever heard anyone in terms of genealogy talking about the 14,000 people. You can't overlook that many people, of whom there is incredible documentation and a rich history of survival, resistance, and really a determination. Oh, thank you, Terry. Thank you for holding up my book cover.
I was just holding up her book, but I think you all bring up a very important point, because people are, you know, Karen Galloway was like, was it one trail, many trails? It was, well, here's the thing. I live in West Tennessee. There were many removals. It wasn't just one. There are different roles that depending on the nation you're looking at, you know, that detail when people arrived. And they basically codify, like they say, okay, these people got here before the large mass forced removal took place. And at least in the Cherokee Nation, that's what the old settler role is. It dictates the people who got there before the forced removal. And that role was then used as a basis for different benefits being dispersed to people of the nations. And those roles were very important because, as we mentioned earlier, sometimes, and I won't even say sometimes, racism did drive a lot of what, you know, the people who were approved on those, if they were freedmen, because those roles determined who received benefits. Whatever the benefit was that was surrounding that role determined that. And so that's another, you know, is another way for sort of the nature of slavery to be continued throughout some of the nations. And so let's talk briefly about
Whoa.
What?
So you just touched upon a good point.
Go ahead.
And I think it kind of dovetails off of what Angela says, that when people are perceived as being oppressed, they tend to get the sympathies of the outside world. And you see this time and time again on Facebook. If you agree with the Native American story, say yes, click yes, I agree with this. Okay.
Right.
And every time I see that, you know, it upsets me, because our story is part of that story and it's never part of that sympathy. Now, you can't tell me when I can go to the National Archives and look at record group M234 and look at the migration papers, and it tells you right there, so-and-so had this many slaves on his way to Indian Territory. He didn't suffer. I have a newspaper article, Chickasaw Nation, the richest nation in the world. Okay, so you can't get sympathy when you're the richest nation in the world. When you travel to Indian Territory and the people who clear the path are your slaves. Okay, when you got there, they cleared the land that your slaves did it. So how is it they get the sympathy and those enslaved people don't? Why is their story being told and sympathy is given to it and ours is not? One of the reasons is we don't know our story and we don't write about our story. And half the people who are tied to this history probably don't know that they have a tie to this history.
You're right.
So
you're absolutely
it's
right.
up to us. to get this information out there. You know, since, like Angela said, since '93, we have seen a sea change of awareness on these issues, because every time I used to bring this up, the first thing I would get from people, Indians own slaves? Come on.
Still today.
You know,
I still get
yeah,
that today.
yeah,
Yeah.
30 years later, we
Yeah.
still are getting this. Well, why is that? And why aren't those enslaved people benefiting like those tribes? You know, I know I'm going off on the edge here, but that's how I am.
Okay, Angela, I'm reeling back in briefly because we have a few.
Okay,
There's another point I was good. We got a few other things we're going to talk about before
please,
we
you
wrap
know,
it up.
don't get me
Yeah.
started.
No, I know, because we all could jump off that bridge fully
All
clothed
right.
and get right back out and jump right back off of it. So Angela touched briefly on this, and I think this is something we need to bring up, because when people hear about things like the federal court decision that happened in August, where the court sided with the Cherokee freedmen and said that the nation had to admit their freedmen as full members of the tribe, and that they had to admit them immediately, after years and years and decades and centuries worth of fighting for that right, and that only the, really in that pure essence, that only the Cherokee have that right now. The Seminoles have it in sort of like they're just different. We'll just put it like that. They're just different. But the reason why I bring that up is there's been this continuous struggle. And that's what I think folks, I hope they get from us when they hear that. Yes, these records are valuable. Yes, you can break through the brick wall very easily. Yes, this is an interesting history and it adds a lot of color and texture. But there also is though we're in a house where we are in two reinforced floors that are reinforced with racism. Whereas the average person of color is only dealing with one floor, we're dealing with two. Because you're dealing with the insulation of the sovereign nation segregation, and then once you left that world, then you had to deal with it in the United States as well, right? And so Angela alluded to earlier that there were uprisings, right? We have to remember, just as the story of slavery is changing in our popular culture, where we're getting stories about people like Nat Turner made into movies, that the whole idea that the enslaved in the 5 slaveholding tribes, that they were just docile and they never rose up. Well, that's like saying the Cherokee slave revolt never took place. There were uprisings. There were revolts there, before the treaties came down, with the U.S. government. And more notably, we moved after the treaties came down into a state of what I call red Jim Crow, which was nothing more than the exact same things that our brothers and sisters were dealing with in the Deep South, right? People typically don't want to associate the fact that some of these 5 civilized tribes, so to speak, they doled out what we can call red Jim Crow. What are some of the discriminatory practices that you all have seen? We talked about the Dawes roll, people being segregated off of it. What are some of the other things that you've seen that happened following the treaties with the U.S. government? And let me back up for a second. The treaties with the U.S. government, what they did was they abolished slavery. They also that was one primary function of them. But, there was a whole piece of limbo that people were in for years because they were living within sovereign nations in the United States. Beth Wiley in the chat room was trying to remember where Don Cheadle's family came from on Finding Your Roots. And that's the only real sort of show I've seen that's tackled this issue where the freedmen were in limbo for an extended period of time. And I think one of the functions of why that took place is because of red Jim Crow, is reestablishing policies and discriminatory practices. So to Terry and to Angela, how have you seen Jim Crow rear its head within these nations post-treaty with the U.S. government?
Well, I think one of the things that's important to talk about when we say treaty, we're talking about the Treaty of 1866, because many of your viewers don't understand. Slavery did not end with the end of the Civil War and the 13th Amendment to the United States, the U.S. Constitution, that ended and abolished slavery officially in the United States. The tribes were not having to obey that particular amendment to the U.S. Constitution. They were a sovereign nation. It took a treaty to be signed in Fort Smith, Arkansas, my hometown, to be signed after the Civil War ended, to abolish slavery officially in these nations. Each tribe treaty, but it wasn't one treaty with 5 different signatures. It was a separate treaty with Cherokees, Choctaw, separate treaty with Creeks, and so on. Now, we talk about that. We talk about the fact that then within the various tribes, you had different things that were going on. Even within the tribes, you had still some black codes. Intermarriage was forbidden in the Choctaw Nation. And African and Choctaw, if they were to marry, it was considered a felony in the nation. We're talking post-Civil War, and we're talking about an individual to receive, 35 lashes on their bare back if they were caught marrying. So we're talking about numerous things that are there. Within the tribes, we know that, and I'll let Terry address the Chickasaw freedmen, because they were a people without a nation up until 1907 with statehood. But you also had other issues. You had several memorials, which were these letters that were written to Congress, memorial of the Cherokee freedmen, memorial of the Chickasaw freedmen, letters to Congress, and you had individuals, including your ancestor, Nika, who also went to Washington to testify and to really testify on behalf of their own people. This was something that was continuous, and these, and of course, this is all leaving a record from the congressional record to the tribal record. And there was continuous struggle to just say, hey, this is what we know as our home. Our parents, speak this language. We live here. We eat the same food. We practice the same customs. We bury our dead in the same way. And so they had a right to remain. And the struggles continued. But I will say one thing. The recent decision in August was not to admit Cherokee freedmen. It's to readmit. They were citizens. They are Cherokee. I am Choctaw. Terry is Chickasaw, no matter what role the ancestors were put on. And it is important that we understand that, that stigma. What was it? I think Ron said in an interview a few weeks ago on Bernice's show. Well, he was told by someone in the Creek Nation, oh, you go away. We don't have anything to do with you. You're nothing but a slave. Oh, really? Well, first of all, having an ancestor who was enslaved is not a point of shame, and you're not going to put a badge of slavery upon me to wear. That shame is yours as the slaveholder. The survival is something that certainly I will wear, and something that I will certainly embrace. But I know Terry has a lot to talk about.
Yes, I was gonna chime in. So Terry, and I also have to add to this point. We have a couple other things. One of them is very important in terms of key resources, and we've got to get to that before time runs out. So Terry, what are some of the things that you've seen? Angela brought up some really good points. My ancestor did testify in front of the Committee on Indian Affairs, talking about the treatment of the Cherokee freedmen post-treaty, which was an area of importance if it's in the congressional record now. That's something you have to remember, right? Congress got involved. What have you seen in terms of, what have you read in terms of the discriminatory practice, how, Red Jim Crow reared his ugly head when it comes to the freedmen, the 5 civilized tribes?
Well, Jim Crow was basically practiced from day one in 1866, when freedmen were supposed to get educational benefits. In the Chickasaw Nation, that was never going to happen. In fact, the Chickasaw Nation never fully recognized them, never took a census of their freedmen, because they never really wanted to give them any acknowledgement whatsoever. They wanted to get rid of them. They wanted them out of the nation. One of the documents that I sent you with those list of names basically was a congressional, I forget, it was a House miscellaneous document 46. Basically, they were offering any freedman who would take it $100 per capita to leave the nation. So their modus operandi was just to get rid of them, because it was a problem for them. If they stayed, they could become part of the nation. They had to deal with the government. Everything. This is one of the reasons why I love the Chickasaw freedmen, because of their adversarial relationship to the nation. It generated loads of paperwork. The congressional record that you can go to, one of my favorites, Senate Report 5013. We're talking maybe 9,000 pages of documents, and I believe this is where your ancestor, you saw their actual testimony before Congress.
Yes.
And I think you're going to get into these records later, but in those testimonies, you hear the plight of the freedmen as they testify before Congress, and why Congress never felt that they had a fiduciary responsibility to protect these people is beyond me, because they would have delegations of freedmen going to Washington, D.C. to fight for equal rights before it was even a concept. Okay,
Yes.
so
Can you say that for the people in the back?
oh, it's fascinating that when we look at equal rights and protest, that if you look at Indian Territory, if you look at the Chickasaw Nation, you will see the seeds of it in its beginning form, because this
Yes.
is what they had to fight tooth and nail for: acceptance into the nation in which they spoke the language, they ate their food, they lived the culture, and yet they were ostracized for the 40 years from 1866 until statehood, never to be recognized, except one time. And that's another congressional record, where in 1873, the Chickasaw Nation, they, before the Choctaw Nation, in fact, which is kind of amazing, they were willing to adopt their former slaves. But because Congress, United States Congress, failed to ratify that document, it meant that they gave them a chance to go back and renege on the adoption. And from that point on, it was just an adversarial relationship. Education, in court system, you couldn't sue a Chickasaw. You could only testify against another freedman. If you look at newspaper articles, you never see anything that's good. It's always a negative. You have to watch
Yep.
what you read, because the way it's couched will give you the wrong impression of what was going on. The
I
fact that they
agree.
could develop the Choctaw and Chickasaw Freedmen Associations, which were basically the NAACP before it was formed in these nations. So you see a lot of history that is parallel to the United States history, but we have a real good documentation of all that was going on, and especially in the congressional record, because everything that they did went to Congress. It had to.
Yeah. Yeah, and I echo everything that Terry and Angela have said. I think all of this is true. You definitely do see the seeds of what came later with the, with the civil rights movement that we're all very familiar with. A lot of that you saw within these nations because they were fighting for equal rights. It just preceded it literally 50 years plus ahead of schedule. I mean, so you literally, it's the exact same thing. When I posted, when I was doing promo for the show tonight, I posted different excerpts from Dawes Commission files. And I talked about one where an ancestor of mine went to apply several times. When he went one time, they just dismissed for that day. Then he went another time, they scratched his name out. He went the next time, they said it was $5 for him to get in the door. That's the equivalent of moving the starting line every single time. It's the equivalent of a literacy test. It's the exact same thing. It's just manifested a different way. And something else we need to consider as well is, even though this decision came down in August, Cherokee freedmen are still fighting. Even though the federal decision took place just this week. If you follow my blog,
Kara Cohen Watts, whatever her name is.
Yes, who was a former member of the tribal council. I tweeted her because I had a question about why she was mounting to try to take an appeal, to have the nation file an appeal when the attorney general said that he was not going to file, and so did the chief. And she's going behind her leadership to try to galvanize people to make them file an appeal. And I tweeted her directly and I said, hey, why are you going behind your leadership? I have a question. I'm a freedman. I have an ancestor on the freedman roll. I also descend from people who are by blood. And matter of fact, me and you are cousins. Literally.
I know she didn't like that.
And I said, hey, I just want to know.
She despised that.
Yeah.
DNA doesn't lie.
DNA doesn't lie. I said, I want to know why are you pursuing this? She didn't respond. Send her another 24 hours later. Hey, FYI, I want to know why you're trying to get an appeal.
Well, when you say you're talking about looking at what's the discriminatory actions that you see, that's one of them, that they continually don't see you as part of that tribal nation.
Human.
Okay, that
too. See you not as human.
Okay, but you're always inferior. It's still, there's a racist foundation to these nations that there still exists today. It's sad to say, when you see people like that who are still stuck in that idea that you cannot be related to them in any way. It happened to me. And it was funny because I knew it was going to happen. When I was asked
Briefly.
to join a descendants of Thomas Love, and the only people that are on there basically has some kind of association with this guy. Now, it was cool until I brought up slavery and how it adversely affected the tribe. And then all of a sudden, I was no longer welcome on that site. Okay. And then they did their best to tell me my research was bogus and that my great grandmother had
Oh,
no
that
Chickasaw.
happened to you too? Because
Yes.
see, after the tweet that I tweeted this weekend, a hit piece was put out about my family and challenging my research,
Yes.
saying that it was faulty.
Yes.
Okay, so basically what we're saying is that it's still not over.
It's not over. You know?
It's still not
Yeah.
over. It's still not over.
Mhm.
But in spite of this, and this is even more the reason why we the three of us definitely, I think everybody on the panel would encourage folks that have Freedmen ancestry to DNA test. This is the big reason why. And it's, as we mentioned before, it's not about trying to prove to
No.
get membership. This is to verify and to give your ancestors their just due, right? As I call out Chief John Rogers and his sons,
Right.
I am avenging for that rape of my ancestor by one of them. The oral history that got passed down that people are doubting and telling me is not accurate when my DNA is saying something else. In fact, once I posted that blog this week, you know, I had different freedmen reach out to me and say, I have the exact same scenario. My ancestors were segregated off of the bi blood roll, yet we have all of these DNA matches that go back to people who were on the bi blood roll. So explain that to me.
Consider this, that one of the fears of having DNA be a part of any recognition of a tribal citizen would affect thousands of people who claim to have citizenship based on their Indian ancestry. You don't see anyone in the five slaveholding tribes saying that there needs to be a blood quantum. Why? Because it would be very few who would have a 1/4 blood quantum that would be able to stay in that nation. It just wouldn't happen. And you pose a threat when I think that we possess the blood that would prove us being more Indian than them.
Exactly.
Okay.
I agree. I agree. All right. So while we still have time, we've had a very meaty conversation. We also have a lot of questions from the chat room we're going to try to get to. Let's talk
Bring
about
it.
key resources. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, doing Freedmen research does not supersede starting correctly when it comes to your genealogy search. You're going to
No.
start with yourself. You're going to go backward to your parents, grandparents, XYZ. Of course, I'm throwing out my resources. Cherry, feel free to chime in. Angela, of course, some of these go cross. They're sort of crosshairs amongst
True.
the nations, right? So vital records, birth, marriage, and death. In fact, Oklahoma just put out their vital records department just put out a website earlier this year that's been great once there was statehood to be able to get, you know, basic information on births and deaths in Oklahoma. Marriages, if you're looking pre-territory, or I'm sorry, pre-statehood, there are certificates on family search that exist for, at least I know with the Cherokee Nation that they're there. Census records for the Cherokee Nation, we're talking U.S. Census 1860. Of course, everyone's thinking, well, that's before the treaty. Well, the Indian Territory extended into Arkansas, and there were people in the Cherokee Nation and other nations that lived in Arkansas, around the areas, Fort Smith, all that stuff. So they'll be on, the slaveholders will be on the U.S. Census there, and they'll also have slave schedules, but they'll be listed under Arkansas. Indian Territory is like sort of like a city. I think that's how it's kind of cockamamie the way that they have it. It's like Indian Territory, Arkansas. Go ahead, Angela. You're trying to chime in. I can hear you already.
Yeah, you will see on some of the cases it will say lands west of Arkansas, and it is at the very end, excuse me, of the Arkansas census if you're looking at the federal census, and it's I guess it was sort of appendage of Arkansas, so to speak, the way it was treated on the records, but it's correct. And also the same way with the slave schedule, you will find it also in the lands west of Arkansas. And if you're looking at microfilm, it'll even have that kind of label on it. But it is at the very end of Yale County, which is the last county in Arkansas alphabetically, and then you'll find Arkansas. So, I mean, you'll find Indian Territory.
Territory. And it's not even consistent either there, because Cherokee Nation is spelled like 5 different ways. It's so
and
weird.
it's chopped up. It's a mess.
Yeah, it's a mess. It's a mess.
Yeah,
All right. So
I
in
think
addition
part
to
of that
that,
was a legal reason because of, I think, Indian Territory, when they migrated, there was carved out of the Arkansas Territory. So some
Out
of
of
the
the
laws,
Arkansas Territory.
right, some of the
Correct.
laws that apply to Indian Territory came out of Arkansas. And because I know one of them, as I was doing some legal research, it had to do with lineal descent. And there was already established law, but it was based out of Arkansas law. So that's
absolutely.
why you'll see a lot of those referrals back to those types of documents.
Absolutely. Okay, moving forward, because we got to get through these pretty quickly. You've got, as I mentioned earlier, you've got the territorial census, and we're talking U.S. Census, 1900. Of course, you've got 1910 through 1940 U.S. Census for the state of Oklahoma. In terms of the Cherokee Nation, you also want to be cognizant of the Kansas State Census, because during the Civil War, a large number of formerly enslaved people and Cherokees moved, or they went into Southeast Kansas, areas that make up Fort Scott, Osawatomie, a lot of those spots. And you'll find, since those censuses take place on the 5s, that you may find your ancestors in those locations. So don't forget about the Kansas State Census. In terms of the Cherokee, we've got 1880. We've got
Chandler.
yes, because it's bedtime and he's like, "Mommy, what are you doing?" Cherokee, we've got 1880 census, 1883, 1886, 1890, 1893, and 1896. Those are all censuses that took place within the Cherokee Nation. And 1880 was key because that was the basis that they used to prove that somebody should be on the approved Dawes rolls. So that's a great one. In terms of rolls and packets and applications and such, we've got the Old Settler Roll, which I brought that up. That will help with slave research. Remember, we have to establish timelines. When did your slaveholder arrive in the Indian Territory from their initial spots out east? That will help you determine that. The Drennan Roll, which is Old Settler Roll, is for the folks who are already relocated to the Cherokee Nation ahead of the forced removal, and the Drennan Roll were all of the new arrivals. Old Settler was 1851, Drennan was 1852. Then we have the Wallace Roll, which that was to settle suits regarding citizenship of freedmen, Shawnee, and Delaware. That spans from 1890 to 1896. After that, we've got Kern Clifton, which was allegedly supposed to fix the issues with the Wallace Roll. That was in 1897. Then we've got Eastern Cherokee applications that had to do with administering stuff for Guion Miller, which of course that took place. Those both were sort of 1906 to 1911. And then we also have the Dawes Roll. There are other rolls, but we are talking specifically about freedmen. Following that, resources, newspapers for Southeast Kansas as well as Indian Territory. Don't think that because people were labeled colored or Negro that they were not talked about in the newspaper. I have found a ton of stuff in newspapers when it comes to those populations. Also, you're dealing with deeds, wills, and probates. In fact, me and Angela just had a conversation today about, or actually maybe that was yesterday, about her great uncle and the fact that she found his probate on Ancestry. And he would have been in the Indian Territory. So you're looking at those counties we talked about earlier. That will give you some clues as to potential ties to one of these nations. U.S. government docs, Committee on Indian Affairs. We talked about the testimony that's available on Google Books. For Cherokee Nation, we also have Moses Whitmire, trustee for the freedmen of the Cherokee Nation versus the Cherokee Nation in the United States. That's a big freedmen case with the Cherokee Nation. Civil War pension files, we touched on that briefly. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Indian Home Guards were Indian Territory installations, as well as the USCT, which was the 1st Kansas unit, 2nd Kansas, which became the 79th and the 83rd in the USCT, land allotment jackets that correspond with the Dawes Commission, as well as other citizenship documents. There is a treasure trove of documents on Ancestry, but they're hidden in collections that are not indexed. One more time. There's a treasure trove on Ancestry, but it's not indexed. You got to go page by page. Things that I'm talking about are citizenship cases. There were 2 courts that happened before the Dawes Commission where freedmen went up in front of the courts in the Cherokee system to bestow them membership or to bestow really citizenship. And there were some freedmen who were approved in these courts, the Chambers Court and the Daniels Court, and the lion's share were not. Those records exist on Ancestry, but they are not indexed. Is there anything else you all want to add that I did not talk about when it comes to the freedmen of the 5 civilized tribes and records and resources?
The Choctaw, Chickasaw. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's important to mention the Creek Nation. We must remember there's the Dunn roll within the Creek Nation, DUNN. I believe it was 1867. I might be wrong. There was also a roll that preceded the Dawes rolls among creeks across the board, including Creek Freedmen, and that is known as the Old Series cards. There is a mistake on Ancestry. You may type in a name of a person who is, I don't know, Grayson, Barnett, McNack, whatever, and you'll see, oh, here's the enrollment card, Dawes card. Here's the enrollment application. Oh, here's their old series card. What Ancestry has put up is a duplicate of the Dawes card. The old series cards have a different look. And our colleague Ron Graham certainly is a good resource for Creek records and for old series cards as well. So I would recommend that. Also for Choctaws, 1885 Choctaw, Chickasaw Freedmen census, and the 1867 Choctaw census did include freedmen as well. I'm done.
M234 is located at the National Archives. You'll find different records, migration records of the tribes coming west. You'll also see some for educational lobbying by some of the freedmen. The M1650 are the 1896 applications for citizenship, which would include Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, and Choctaw. The congressional record is just a mine field of information that you'll get. One of the things I always wanted to do is try to find my ancestors' voices in these documents. And there's a couple of them, and one recently I found where Betty refused to accept land allotment cards because she was determined to be placed on the citizenship roll. That was great for me because I finally got to see the nature of the individual, that she was so determined that she refused several acres of land because she was determined to be classified one way, and that was it from the time she was born to the time she died. Family Search has records on schools in the different counties within Indian Territory. The 1898 Choctaw census, where you will see Choctaw freedmen and those Choctaw freedmen living in Chickasaw Nation are enumerated. The Western History collection at OU, especially the Melvin Cornish collection, I find interesting because he was part of the law firm that represented the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations. And I've always wanted to see the opposing view of what I could find from the people representing freedmen, in thinking that there would be some different records, and not to my surprise, there were some different records. So I mean, there are all of the other records that everybody else has mentioned. You can't go wrong, but you can look outside of the Dawes records. And I think one thing we all have to remember when you read books, read the index and read because
The footnotes.
the footnotes,
Yes, and the
Because
footnotes. Yes.
the footnotes opened up a world of information for me when I started looking at these documents, and it just one thing led to another. So if there's anything that you want to do, you got to do outside reading. You know, and I know we don't like to do it, but you have to do outside reading, and you have to check those footnotes, because the footnotes are where that information comes from. And if you follow them, you'll follow a lot of information.
I think I'm trying to remember if any one of us talked about the Indian Pioneer Papers.
Oh,
That's another huge.
good one.
Yeah, that's another huge thing. That basically is the equivalent to the slave narratives and for the freedmen. But it of course encapsulates more than just, freedmen. But check, those are on Ancestry and they're indexed. So maybe if you search a name in there, or maybe a location, maybe slaveholder, you can see what pops up. Any final thoughts before we go?
Well, you don't have to actually go through Ancestry if you don't have an account, because you can go through the OU site and pull those up also.
Yes, you can. Anything else before we go into? I'm going to take a few questions because we're way over time.
Oh, well, take some questions.
Yeah,
Since I missed a half hour.
I have to kind of scroll up to get to some of the questions that people were asking. Let's see. Why are there counties in Alabama and Mississippi named Choctaw? What is the history as it relates to the nation?
These nations came from that part of the country. These areas were, if you're in Choctaw County, Alabama, that was at one time, I think I mentioned it earlier, part of that part of the state was Choctaw territory. You'll find Okmulgee, Oklahoma. You find Okmulgee, Georgia. You find a lot of the same. You have Tallahassee, Florida, but you have Tallahassee. So you're going to find a lot of duplicates because, again, that was where they came from. So that's, and just read the local history and it'll point you to the same.
Absolutely. And another question, and I think I can answer this one. Someone asked, what are the tribes that came from Texas to Oklahoma? I am not familiar with that, but I can tell you that a lot of slaveholding tribes people left the area during the Civil War and went to Texas, and some people stayed. I don't know about the reverse. I can't tell you about the reverse. But in the
there are some.
Yeah, in the context of the 5 civilized tribes, I know that did happen.
Correct. And there are some tribes. There are about 40 tribes now in the state of Oklahoma, which I think it's meaning federally recognized tribes. Their official headquarters is there. The Comanches are there. There are other tribes that are there as well. Also in the tiny northeast corner, you'll find Shawnees, you'll find Delawares, you'll find other tribes that were also removed. There were other tribes besides the 5 tribes removed to the territory. Sac and Fox, Potawatomi, other tribes too. But there were some in Texas, and but in the context of our chat, certainly it's a different discussion.
All right. Well, any parting thoughts before we get to Ask Mariah? You guys want to say anything? I know we had to move through a lot of this very quickly. I think we actually did fairly well to get through all of it in an hour and 45 minutes. To be frank, because we really did have to speed through.
It was a great overview and really, really helpful. Because I mean, I've read other histories, but there's so much that's left out, and it's really shocking to me in some ways that something that's so that went on for so long and impacted so many people, and then you just leave them invisible, basically, in these other records when people are starting to look for information. So thank you so much for sharing, Angela and Terry. I really appreciate it, Mika.
Thank you, Ellen.
Yeah.
You know, Ellen, I don't think people actually looked for it, because a lot of, you have to consider, like with me, my father left Oklahoma in 43 or something like that, and he never discussed his family. So there's a void, and there could be a void with a lot of people. We just don't know our own history. And until we reclaim it, no one else will know it. But it's so well documented that there's a great joy in rediscovering this history.
It's just there waiting for you. That's what I would add. And I know that as we encourage more freedmen to do DNA testing, I know that when I discover that somebody is on my freedman line of my family, that's the first thing I tell them is, do you know you're a Cherokee freedman? If so, what is your tie back to Oklahoma? What county did your family live in? Okay, great. And usually when they tell me that information, I can almost exactly find the Dawes packet and send them that, because it's literally like a step, and to echo what Terry said, my grandmother left Oklahoma before she was age 5.
Wow.
This was 1925. And so, I'm 3 or 4 states removed from Oklahoma, but I did grow up with a big base of family in Kansas City. And so luckily those folks kept the pictures, they kept the stories. My grandmother passed some to my dad, who then passed it to me. And so, that's the point is, we have to tell these stories. We have to change the narrative, because the voices of our ancestors are in the documents. Just as we mentioned earlier, a lot of their fights were precursors to the movement that we saw later on. And they didn't just lay down and take it and say, oh no, they're going to strip our rights from us and we're not going to do anything. No, they fought. And that's the point, is that we should be doing the same thing. Angela, anything else you want to say before Ask Mariah?
There's plenty more I can say, but let's get on Ask Mariah. Let's bring it on.
All right. We're moving on. Feel free to pop some stuff in the chat. You may want to see if people can stay a little bit over so that you can answer questions directly. There are a lot of questions about other things. As we mentioned earlier, this is a conversation that is about the 5 civilized tribes, or the 5 slaveholding tribes. All right. So it's time for Ask Mariah. Favorite part of the show, of course, it's when our viewers can submit questions, queries, conundrums to our panel, and they can answer live right as you watch. Terry, do not feel obligated to stay on, although, you know, you are lucky because you're on West Coast time, so it's only almost 8 o'clock for you.
Yeah, but my body's on East Coast time.
So I have to always remind folks that the panel has not seen these questions or this query beforehand, because they will try to work it to death. I always hold the information so that they will not do that. All right, so here we go with Ask Mariah. All right, this comes from Jen Carter. She says, I'm not able to locate any information on my 2 times great-grandfather, whose name is William Michael Murphy. Oral history says he was the son of an Irishman and a Native American woman. Oh, haven't we heard that? I wonder if she had high cheekbones and long hair that she could sit on. I have not found him in any census anywhere near my second great-grandmother or her family. So far, the family has not been able to find a birth, death, marriage, or will on William Michael. We take the assumption he was born about 1860 somewhere in Indian Territory. My great-grandfather, William Michael was born in Indian Territory and was half Indian. We all have heard this story. I think a lot of us have. All right. So moving forward, she says her great-grandfather was named William Columbus Murphy. So this is the son of the previous William Murphy, born 1827, October 12th, 1887 in Canton, Illinois. But he also says he was born in Halifax, Iowa on his Social Security application dated 1937. So he's everywhere, right? Which they found out there's no such place as Halifax, Iowa.
It's like, yeah.
So
That's pretty good.
So her 2 times great-grandfather didn't seem to tell the truth all the time for some reason. Now, on William Columbus's marriage application, which happened in 1920 in Fort Wayne, Indiana, he says he was born in Iowa and his father was born in Indian Territory and was deceased. So that was as of 1920. Remember, we're dealing with the potential 1860 birth date. He says he was born in Iowa, father was born in Indian Territory, okay? He also says he was colored on the marriage license, but his World War I registration says he is Caucasian. He served in World War I, listed his father as William Murphy, and nothing else. Moving forward, the 2 times great-grandmother who married William Columbus was named Nellie McCorkle. She was born about 1866, Greenville, Tennessee. Not located a marriage record for her and William Michael. Sorry, she was married to William Michael. Nellie remarried in 1896 to Henry Giles, a coal miner born about 1857 in North Carolina in Bell County, Tennessee. They had 2 children. Nellie is listed as the bride and named Nellie Murphy. Nellie and Henry are listed in the U.S. Census in 1900, in Illinois and Iowa State Census in 1905. Nellie died between 1910 and 1915. The Iowa State Census in 1915 says her second husband, Henry Giles, is a widow. She has taken an ancestry DNA test and no Native American has shown up. Her uncles have taken the DNA test and no Native American shows up on their side either, which does not confirm the oral history. There also are no existing DNA matches to any Murphys or any Native Americans.
Wow.
All right, what does Jen do?
Well,
You go to Iowa, North Carolina, and Tennessee and start digging.
I probably would suggest anyway, since there's an approximate birth year of 1860, to see, I would look at the 1860 census of free citizens in the Cherokee Nation. Just well, I'd look in all the nations actually. It's not a huge reel of microfilm, not too many images. You should be able to get through it. And in fact, a majority of the people who were listed as citizens in an 1860 census in the territory and all of the tribes were white. In fact, although there were some free people of color as well. And I would just take a look just for the heck of it, since there was a tie there. I would also be curious about that Iowa. No, Halifax, Iowa. Halifax is a neighborhood or something in maybe Des Moines or maybe another city. I don't know. I think she mentioned another city there. But it's really kind of interesting just to see. I don't know if she mentioned probate records or not, or if there was any probate record to be found. I would certainly, keep an open mind there. It doesn't seem as if there may be a real a tie to any of the nations, although there are records occasionally of intruders, but it seems as if they left Indian territory before the intruder census was taken, so I'm not sure about that either. So that's a tough one. That's interesting.
One thing that sticks out in my mind is that the migrations in the northern part of the country, Iowa, Tennessee, Illinois, and if they were in Indian territory, they would be in the northern part of it. And as you say there, just because they were living in Indian territory and not Native American doesn't mean that somebody wasn't born in Indian territory.
In the territory.
Yeah. Because there were probably no census records. Now remember, for freedmen or the nation itself, there may be a census, but for outsiders, intruders, it would have to be on the United States census form. And I don't recall many in Indian territory around the 1870s.
Yeah, they were gone by 1880 to Ohio, I think, which is very, very interesting in itself. It sounds as if the migration pattern seems to mirror migratory patterns of free people of color that you even see before the Civil War, going towards Ohio, and that movement towards states that considered part of the frontier as well, Iowa, Illinois. It's kind of interesting.
Hold on, let me pause. Let me pause you, because the chat room is like, intruders? What do you mean intruders?
Well, they're illegal immigrants to Indian territory.
Yes, illegal aliens, yes. People who were not part of the nations, who were the people who were really expected to have legal permission to reside in Indian territory. And I'm talking about the years prior to the Oklahoma land rush, which was 1889. But even so, in the 1890s, there were the intruder census. In other words, people who really just said, hey, there's some land to the west. Let's go. Let's just see some land. Let's squat on it, and let's just go there. And there were many families from multiple states. And at one point, there were so many, it was decided before even that Dawes period really got underway, well, let's make a census of the intruders, people from other states who don't belong here, but they're here.
But wait a minute, though. I've seen Ike Rogers as an intruder.
Well, Ike, he had an interesting reputation, and some people probably said, Ike, what are you doing here? And put him down.
Cherokee Freedmen. That's why I'm like, come on.
The U.S. Deputy Marshal.
Well, yeah, there were state Negroes that were considered intruders.
Yeah, and they considered him an intruder in the Cherokee Nation, which is where he was born. So, yes, it is quote unquote illegal aliens and state people. That's how they usually refer to people who are from the United States. They'll call them the state person.
State Negroes.
Right. State Negroes. State person. Right. And so, yeah, I think just to
in fact, I believe on the 1890 census of Chickasaw Nation, it will list Indian Negro, State Negro, and Chickasaw or Indian or whatever, So, and intruder.
An intruder, yeah. So I think I would add. By the way, go ahead, Angela.
No, go ahead. No. Go ahead. We got to get back.
I just getting back to Jen's question, because she's trying to find William Murphy in potentially allegedly Indian territory.
Right.
I
Oh, there
I
was one
think
other thing about the question that said Halifax, and I was wondering if there was a reference to Virginia.
no, there was no reference to
Sure.
Virginia. It was
Okay.
Iowa, and Indian Territory. That's all I saw based on the query. I was going to suggest
Okay.
to them they probably need to data mine their DNA matches and look for repetition. This is something I feel like I say every single week on this portion of the show when it comes to DNA matches. I'm talking repetition in pedigrees, surnames, and locations, for that particular line, isolating that line of that family. Once, being able to separate out results, to a paternal and maternal side, and being able to direct matches to a particular line of your family. I highly suggest doing that because that may provide you some clues. I think William lived a sort of interesting existence, and I don't necessarily buy the Indian Territory story. Folks are saying maybe a different Halifax, like North Carolina, or maybe Canada, or something like that. Because that's the first thing I thought of was Halifax, Nova Scotia. That's
Nova
the first thing I
Scotia,
thought.
right.
Yeah, that's the first thing I thought
Yeah.
about.
Well, there are Murphys in Indian Territory, and of course there are also Macintoshes and a lot of other Irish names and Scotch-Irish names and straight up Scottish names. And so I don't find that Murphy name necessarily to be an anomaly, but
Isn't that one of the precautionary tales that you tell people, because people will glom onto a surname and see it somewhere and then just swear up and down that's them. So you got to be careful of that also. And William Murphy is not a very uncommon name.
No,
True.
it's not. It's not. So I would say I think her best bet is to go to locations where she knows the family was at directly and do on-site research, because I don't think this is an online solvable thing. Sometimes when we do research, you've got to go. The only way you're going to find out is if you go on site, and I think some on-site needs to happen. Yeah. And I would say, Ellen mentions pulling the military records, which it sounds like that was already done, and there was no information other than just the father's name. So, and like I said, in some instances like this, it may just be waiting for the right DNA match to come down. And sometimes that happens quickly. Sometimes it takes time for that to develop. So, it's not, there's no magic bullets in genealogy, especially when you're talking about people of color that aren't magic bullets. Sorry. Okay, and questions from the chat room or comments: Is Murphy his real name? I don't think it is. I don't think it is.
Well, he was confused as being colored, and I think one's mulatto and Caucasian. So Murphy's all over the place.
It sure is.
Yeah.
It sure is. I think so too. All right. Well, moving forward. Let's go ahead. We've got a few things we got to get to before we close up shop tonight. Just a reminder to everybody, if you submit a case to Ask Mariah, you get entered into a chance to win a free 4-day pass to Roots Tech 2018, taking place February 28th to March 3rd at the Salt Palace in Salt Lake City. So don't forget to check the description of this recording and any episode of BlackProGen Live for the...
Does that include present guests?
Yes, that includes present guests. You can do so.
Okay.
Yes. Anybody that submits for Ask Mariah, you will be automatically entered. So maybe you will get selected. We'll see. Just a reminder, in honor of National Novel Writing Month, NaNoWriMo, join us for the last episode of the 2017 season of BlackProGen Live, where we discuss transforming your family history research into a creative literary project. We're going to have a special guest. Anita Henderson is going to be joining us. So be sure to tune in for the last episode entitled Pad and My Pen on Wednesday, November 29th, 2017. Same time, same bat channel. Briefly, into current events, and I almost didn't put this in there, but there was no way I could not do that. In the latest episode of We Done Told Y'all just now admitting to it. Look at God.
We done told y'all.
We done told y'all. That's what this current event should be called.
Oh.
you, you guys let us know if we should just call current events we done told y'all, because it seems like every episode it's just a confirmation. It's like, yes, the trauma of slavery has affected for people for generations. This study proves that. We done told y'all that.
We done told y'all.
We done told y'all. It literally should be called that. All right, going back to current events. This one is a very interesting one. Okay, so over the course of and this is from Political Insider, which is a blog by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. It's the major paper in Atlanta. Over the course of this year and its latest issue, the Georgia Historical Quarterly has pointedly acknowledged that throughout much of its lifetime, the GHQ was a trafficker in the lost cause. We always talk about the lost cause on this show, which is the effort that was made to change the narrative of the Civil War and the origins of it to not being about slavery, you know, being about everything else but that. And so the GHQ, when it began, was informed by this lost cause ideology. The leading proponents of it were United States Daughters of the Confederacy, who were mostly responsible for the Confederate monuments that we see now. And this is a quote from Glenn McNair, who is the editor of the Georgia Historical Quarterly and is a professor of history at Kenyon College in Ohio. And so in their most recent edition, the lead essay focuses on E. Merton Coulter, who served as the Quarterly's first professional editor for 50 years until 1973. He was a romanticizer of the South. Hold on, I have to pause for you guys so we can get reaction. Because you're just wait until I finish reading this.
Oh, yeah.
So he was the first professional editor for 50 years until 1973. Quote, he was a romanticizer of the Old South, the Confederacy, and Reconstruction who contributed to the South's closed intellectual society and who consciously employed his skills as a historian to bolster the white South's rejection of social justice for Blacks. Writes Fred Arthur Bailey, a history professor retired from Abilene Christian University in Texas. Coulter's view of Confederate history was incorporated into Southern public schools textbooks over decades.
Yeah.
So this editor of this historical quarterly is partly to blame for the lost cause being peddled in textbooks across the South. The blogger, who's named Jim Galloway, who wrote this piece, he goes further and states, "Allow me to explain why this admission matters. In the largest sense, the above paragraphs break no particularly new ground and would seem obvious to many, but history isn't just a recitation of facts. Who tells the story matters, as does when the telling occurs. The Georgia Historical Quarterly began its publication in 1917, and its circulation is small, but its parent organization, the Savannah-based Georgia Historical Society, was founded in 1839. It may be the oldest private organization in the state, and age has its advantages. Politically, this society is plugged in deeply. Its current board chairman is a man named Vince Dooley, who some may remember, who was the coach of the University of Georgia. He was a head football coach. In other words, in the midst of another debate over the saltiness of Robert E. Lee, Jeff Davis, and Stonewall Jackson sure to occur in the legislature come January, a foundational state organization with deep political roots is publicly, ostentatiously siding with a Southern origin story that isn't separate but equal, that doesn't tell Black Georgia one thing while throwing a wink at white Georgia. This is crazy. So here's the thing. Yeah, so here's the thing. Here's the thing. The editor of the Quarterly is Black. and he has been the editor for 7 years.
Oh, wow. Stop it.
Nobody.
That's not true. That's fake news.
No, it is real. So the reason why this is great current events and why there was no way I could not talk about this, because it came out yesterday, is the fact that a historical society, many of us watching, many of us on this panel are parts of genealogical societies, genealogical and historical societies. Are we peddling myths to our membership? Hold on.
No.
But we have to ask this question, right? We can't just speak from a person of color. I find myself fighting them all the time. Well, that's what I was gonna. That's what I was gonna say.
The myth of the civilized tribe.
But that's the thing. I'm saying, as a genealogy, family history universe, right? We have
I
we
think we
have a
try
duty,
not.
right? We have a duty.
Yeah.
But this
Right.
organization has been around for a long time. Their publication has been around for a long time, and they have now just admitted that they have sold wolf ticket, as we say in the Bay or in California. They have sold wolf tickets for over 100 years.
I doubt if they're the only ones, though.
They're not the
They're
only
not.
ones.
They're not.
You know what I mean?
But-
I think you said it
but-
before. Is
They're
like, who
not.
gets to write the story? And you know,
Right.
and age has its benefits.
Yeah, the other thing is that they're realizing that this narrative isn't playing to a lot of people anymore. They're not buying it. So the solution was to fess up now, because maybe we'll get some of that audience back. Or maybe
Yeah,
we'll get a
Plus, you got
different
people
audience.
like us out there who
Or
are
a new
debunking this
audience. Or a new audience.
Yeah. And I guess that'll be the proof the next what will come out in that journal, although I'm sure there's a lot of people will be looking at that with a little bit of side eye, going like, I'm not subscribing until I see something more concrete coming out of this. And I don't know where do they go now? I mean, what are they doing for people? Because they're part of a community, and are they changing their allegiances on a community level? And I guess that would be another question I would have about it.
I want to hop in here, because this brings us back to the discussion of why we need to write our own stories.
There you go,
Hello?
Teresa.
Right.
This little thing here, so what? Okay. What is important is that we get out, we do the research, and we circulate the truth, and it's the historical truth. This whole episode is just historical erasure. They want to keep us in the past, and we need to bring the past to the present and revise it and tell the truth.
Well, it has to be done well too, because one of the problems is that,
Exactly.
they're presenting themselves as a bastion of authority, and then,
Yeah.
But it's true. But we have a voice, and we have to use it. I am so happy, and I'm going to go back, Nika, to your last blog post. Okay, in 24 to 48 hours, Nika has been subjected by a red Jim Crow person to casting doubt on her story. Her story is well documented. Her story has DNA proof.
Right.
2 other individuals who've been allowed to be part of the tribe forever. Whereas her own DNA plus documented history is proof enough. And we need to point that out. I was particularly offended with the insinuation that we, Black professional genealogists, don't know how to do our research, or our research is suspect.
Definitely.
It is not suspect.
No, it's not.
Well, that's a very good point. One of the things that you got to understand, we talk about standards, and we do need standards. We must adhere to them. Although, ironically, the issue of standards did not arise until people of color started joining the genealogy community. Suddenly, standards, we must have, seriously. I mean, we know, and there, plenty of people make errors. I would love to see how many errors could be found in a whole lot of published genealogies upon which many people have joined many distinguished organizations. We know up until the 1990s, people of color could not join NGS. We also know that happened. We also know certain people in the leaders, various aspects of our own community, who have questioned many things. There have been plenty of genealogies that have been published, some of which have been popular. But until suddenly, this one guy write a story about his family. Not only did he do that, he became a bestseller. They made a movie. They made a TV miniseries out of it. Suddenly, let's go investigate the research. Now, granted, there were errors, no question. But to the degree in which the errors and the nature in which really that it seems to be a pattern. Let me see if your research is really is there really any integrity to what you're doing?
Casting shade on what you do.
Where the rub. Yeah, here's the rub though. I mean, and here I'm about to tie this back into the Freedmen discussion that we're talking about. We talked about doubtful and rejected freedmen, right?
Mhm.
Where they placed their claim, and they presented their testimony in front of the commission, and they said, these are my parents, these are my grandparents, these are my folks. And they did not get admitted because they were doubted. They were rejected. Their accounting of events in their history was challenged. It was considered not valid. This is the exact same thing
That's
that
right.
we're seeing right now manifest with regard to us doing our research. See, here's the thing. And there's a reason why, and I'm just going to say this publicly. There's a reason why we won't give you the special sauce. Because a lot of times what happens is that people will watch you and then they all of a sudden become an expert at what you have spent years honing and doing. That's not saying that we have a complete market on people of color genealogy research. No, that's not saying that. But too many folks will come in and co-opt and then become true. Your face is killing me. Please come off of mute. I just need you to come off of mute right now.
You better say that.
Because it's true. And then what happens is they get a little bit of information and they become experts, and then they proceed to tell us what we're not doing right when we can see holes a mile wide behind what they're doing. Let's just keep it yes, Shelley Murphy said intruders. Yes, intruders. Can we start an intruders roll? An intruder census.
But Nika, I want to add something different here, which is kind of sad. Okay. On my Greenwich, Connecticut line, I'm not necessarily choosing to tell the story of my direct lion ancestor because that person was a slave owner. I had no interest. But I am working with some of my white cousins on a different lion line where we're discovering a tremendous history that goes back to both white and black abolitionists, the Underground Railroad. And you just wonder how much information would these red Jim Crow Cherokees, if they just went hand in hand with the Cherokee Freedmen and completed a true discussion of the history of this country and the history of,
y'all got the collection. Pass her the plate.
But people are missing the larger history. This isn't just a black history or a red Jim Crow. This is history. And if we just come together and tell the complete story of how history was actually experienced, not by one person, but by multiple people and peoples, put it together, then we have a historical truth. Okay, but by people doubting evidence that is right there, that is proof, that is documented and through DNA, and denying and still denying the very experience of the Cherokee Freedmen, it's ridiculous. And we're gonna call it out. We have to. What is BlackProGen but an unapologetic black view of things, people of color view of things? We're not going to stand here. A lot of us have voices. A lot of us have blogs. A lot of us are on the front line, ready, willing, and able to call it out as we see it. And we have to do that. There are power in numbers, and that's what we need to do. Am I wrong?
No, I think the collection pay has been passed. Decision time has happened. Folks have fallen out. Angela's over there putting crosses on folks' heads with the anointed oil. Terry has passed the collection plate. He's taking it to the back to count the offering. True is fanning people. Ellen is laying the fallout rag on folks to make sure that their skirts don't come up too high and you can't see their business out on the street in the church. Okay,
I got one of those too.
But here's the thing, that and this is a great segue into closing out the show. But really, you all, that's the point of BlackProGen Live. That's the whole reason why I had the idea for this, is because I saw how we were being marginalized, how our stories were just being held into these blogs, how I knew all these people that have these amazing skill sets and were amazing researchers, but they weren't being given the opportunity to share those skills or to tell those stories or to really illuminate parts of history because they had more melanin than everybody else, or because the story that they came with wasn't nice and pretty and sugary. It was straight up black coffee, no cream, no sugar. Okay. And sometimes we need a little bit of sugar. Sometimes Ellen has a shirt on. Sometimes we
Oh,
need a
you
little
guys
bit
have
of
your shirt on.
your both of their shirts on. Sometimes you need a little bit of sugar. Sometimes you need a little bit of cream. Sometimes you need both of it. You know, both of those things. But at the end of the day, we still have a story. And it's still just as valuable, and we are as much a part of the fabric of that flag that makes up those 50 stars and those stripes as anybody else. And if you remove one thread, that unravels everything.
Mm-hmm.
One thread can unravel all of it. And I think that's the issue that we have so much right now. We're talking about people not wanting to believe the truth. That is a huge issue right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's an indictment of our educational system.
Oh,
Think about what we
definitely.
just talked about, right? With regard to textbooks being framed from the lost cause perspective, and the generations of people that have learned this information, and now couple that with not being taught critical thinking skills, you don't know how to weigh your evidence.
Mm-hmm.
So now you're at a conflict psychologically and intellectually, because a person who is in a key role in leadership over you is telling you one thing and their actions are saying something else. Now, I'm not saying genealogy can save the world from North Korea or whatever, but what I am saying is that your unique voice, anybody who is watching this, whether you're a person of color or you're not, whether you're a freedman of the 5 civilized tribes or you're not, or if you're still peddling that Blackfoot myth, whatever it is, right? Get to the bottom of what the truth is. And when you get together with your family next week and those stories come out across that table and you have context for everything that you're seeing, that is your opportunity to change the narrative. And in some spaces, you might be taking a huge risk. You might be sitting in the house or sitting on land where people were enslaved, but nobody in your family will talk about it. Maybe it's unearthing that slave narrative that talks about the environment that your family lived in. Or maybe it's going down and looking at the family papers. Maybe it's releasing the names of those enslaved that your family owned, so that those descendants of those enslaved people can find out who their people are and where they came from. But I challenge everybody. I challenge everybody. Right? To really, seriously, I challenge everybody, take a risk this Thanksgiving. And this includes people of color. When you hear those stories coming out over the table about somebody being Indian and they're not, shut it down.
Yeah.
Challenge it. I'm not saying you say, no, be tactful, but present the evidence. Say, you know what? I looked that up. And here's actually what I found. And present the parts of the story about that person that colors them and adds breadth to them, but doesn't detract from them just by the fact that you said that they weren't Native American. We owe our ancestors that truth. We owe them that space. But don't diminish their experience, especially if they're not Native American, with the fact that you can't register for membership. If you've learned anything from us tonight, you've learned that it's not about that. Yes, that's a possibility, but it's really not about that. All right, before I get into the last comments, go right on ahead, y'all. Say your piece, because I'm gonna close out after this.
I'm going to add here in honor of Angela and Nika and Terry, I retweeted out my blog post, DNA Doesn't Lie. But I want to direct you to the second half of that post, because I actually, because I had people coming at me, I actually developed a primer for people who find out that they have DNA cousins of color. And I challenge all of you to read that and forward it to people so they don't trip. You know, there's many ways we can be related to people covered, not just through slaves. I am actually the descendant of a first-generation Irish American. Although I'm Black and Puerto Rican, my maternal line goes back to Ireland. I come from, my ancestors were in Northeast port cities. We have a bunch of immigrant European women who came in, nothing to do with slavery. You know, so I have 10 points and just share them, because we don't want people tripping. You know, people don't even know. They take a DNA test, they just don't know what comes up, and they might be confused, you know, and they might automatically assume everything has to do with slavery, and sometimes it doesn't.
And sometimes it doesn't.
But if it does, there are things they could do to help us, even though they think they can't. They may be hundreds of years away, but they may have surnames. They may have wills that they can direct, you know. So there is something that people can do, and I just wanted to put it there. I wrote it a primer for people who find out so they're not shocked, know how to react about how to deal with DNA cousins of color. And I want to remind people of that.
And it's, something else that I will say too is coming up probably in the next week or so, I'm going to have a conversation actually with my best friend from the other perspective, for someone who identifies as African American, getting those DNA results and having to reconcile what that means for identity. And how she approaches life and in her line of work and what she does in terms of teaching equity to other people, and how now she's using that as an opportunity to teach people about how they can transfer this into their environments, whether it's through social work or whether it's in the educational field. It's going to be a very interesting and nuanced conversation, I think, especially somebody who is a person of color who's gotten, DNA results that they were kind of shocked by. I definitely stay tuned. I'll let everybody know when that's happening. So before we go, because you guys got to remember, we only have one episode left for 2017, just one. And since episode 47 is our last for 2017, don't forget to stay tuned for updates on what's coming up in 2018. We've got a new look, new theme,
and fancy.
Yes, and 26 shows. 26. I hope you guys realize that's how many of these we do in a year. 26 shows to get you up to speed on all things people of color, genealogy, and family history related. So be sure to stay tuned for the 2018 season broadcast schedule that is going to be coming out soon when it comes to BlackProGen Live. Also want to remind you, tomorrow we've got an episode of Researchers at the National Archives and Beyond, Blog Talk Radio with Bernice Bennett. She's going to be talking to Anita Henderson and Christine Easterling about writing and the accountability partner. We've got the next iteration of the African Roots podcast from Angela Walton Raji coming out this Friday, November 17th. We also have Mondays with Myr and Wacky Wednesday with our buddy, Dear Myrtle. We also want to remind you to get the latest and greatest from BlackProGen in your inbox. Subscribe to the Lowdown today. That's a unified feed of our blogs, podcasts, anything that this group puts out, plus friends. You can get that directly in your inbox. Check the description of the recording of this and any BlackProGen Live episode for the link to subscribe to the Lowdown. Also, don't forget to let us know what you think. Did you like this show? Did you think it was awesome? Was there something we left out? Someone tweeted that they submitted to Ask Mariah and they didn't get an answer. So I responded back to them. Hey, girl, what's going on, Andy? We saw you, girl. We're going to answer. Let us know. We respond, okay? Be sure to tweet us at BlackProGen. Use the hashtag BlackProGen. And the chat room has been flying. We've gotten great feedback. This is my first show, but not the last. I enjoyed you all. How exciting. Love it. This was a great show. This has been very interesting and informational. I appreciate the work being done. Let's get Florida popping this year, y'all. That's Tyrone Craig.
Yes.
We got you covered, Tyrone. We have not forgotten Florida and Tennessee. Somehow, I don't know how that happened. But on behalf of everybody, we are like 2 hours in. That's all right. We had a lot of content to cover. Terry, thank you so much for staying with us. I'm so grateful for all of your knowledge, your friendship. Everything has been awesome. Go ahead,
Can
Terry.
I say one thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, Angela, I just got a call from somebody in Sacramento talking about your presentation coming up March, and they asked me if I would be interested in presenting. I think it would be a great time to invite other Freedmen descendants to be there.
Oh, you're saying you want me to come? Really?
Yes. Well, get on the list and present. We could close it down, okay?
Well, hey, look, if somebody has offered me a little bit of coins to get out there now, maybe I could bundle it with Agsnick or something. We'll see.
Well, they never offered me anything, but that's another story. But I think it's a good opportunity. Two,
all right. Well,
at the heart of what we do, and from what I've seen, even on Skip Gates's program, we are dealing with a lot of identity. People are becoming aware of identity through genealogy and DNA. And for a lot of people, it becomes emotional. And one of the things I learned from a presentation given by Dr. Daniel Littlefield is, one, we have to learn our history better than everybody else. And two, when you do that, you take the emotion out of the argument. So when people come at you about your research not being up to par, take the emotion out of the argument, because what you have are facts and the ability to communicate it. Okay.
That's right.
And then the last
Very
of
well.
one of the true philosophers of the world, the cowardly lion, you must have courage to present all of this stuff. Okay. You need that
That is my
courage.
theme in
I like
Sacramento.
Okay.
The courage to tell your story.
Courage.
I'm gonna stand in my true roots.
Come on now.
There you go.
All right. Well, you all, thank you so much for hanging out with us. That we kept the audience the entire time. In fact, I think this is the
Wow.
largest live audience we've had this entire year.
Wow.
So thank you for skewing all of my data I just got. I have to go and redo it, but that's all right. So on behalf of Angela Walton Raji in Maryland, Ellen Fernandez Sacco in Florida, Teresa Vega in New York, Terry Ligon in California, and True Lewis in Kentucky, I am Nika Smith, host of BlackProGen Live. We will see you Wednesday, November 29th for Pad in My Pen, Writing Your Family History. Have a good evening, you guys.
Love it.